I'm Christian, the main interviewer,
I'm Josue, the backup interviewer.
and behind the camera is Miguel Herrera, our videographer. And today, on November 24th, 2018, we're interviewing Michael Chaney in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Okay, so you moved from Minneapolis to Shorewood in 1956. What was the transition like from Milwaukee to Milwaukee, and what were your first impressions of the city?
First of all, I didn't want to move. I'd had a lot of friends. I loved the city, had a lot of fun. But my dad got transferred because of business in the company he worked for, so we had no choice. The area we were at right now, I've lived here for over 60 years. My first impression was we had a nice house, a nice block, a lot of convenient stores and businesses were nearby. Gas station was a block away, drugstore a block away, grocery store, my dentist was a half a block away. Church and school, St. Robert, was about 2 blocks away. There seemed to be a lot of kids on the block. So after all, it turned out pretty well. I got pretty comfortable.
And what was the job your father came here to do?
He worked for a glass manufacturing company, and a lot of their business was producing beer bottles. And since Milwaukee was considered the beer capital of the world at the time with a ton of breweries, he was asked to become a district manager and open an office here. So that was the main reason we had to move here. My parents had a few friends and relatives in town, but after that, I didn't know anybody. We didn't know anybody else. So it was all new as far as neighbors and friends. I came from a public school. I was there for 6 years. The reason we went to public school is because we only had one car in Minneapolis. And the public school was in walking distance. Here, the Catholic school was 2 blocks away, so my brother and sister and I all started at St. Robert.
Do you remember the specific company that your dad was working
It's called Hazel Atlas Glass Company, and I think their main offices were in Pennsylvania, but I don't remember exactly.
And do you know the specific brewery they were working with?
Well, Schlitz and Pabst and Miller were the big 3. So his company sold a lot of beer bottles to those the big 3, and there were probably other smaller breweries that bought beer bottles too. Back then, there were no cans. Everything was in bottles. Cans came along a few years later.
Okay, so what were your thoughts about your new neighborhood, and was it easy to make friends in your neighborhood?
I liked the neighborhood. It was a little different than when I was used to. We were 3 blocks from Lake Michigan, which is kind of nice. There were a lot of kids on the block, various ages, but some about my age, and some that went to St. Robert, so I was very comfortable. It turned out to be pretty happy.
Was your family Catholic, and if so, what church did you attend?
My family was Catholic. What was the second part of that?
What church did you attend?
Oh, we went to St. Robert, which was like 2 blocks away. My dad was not Catholic, but as I said, I started 6th grade at St. Robert. My brother was in 4th, and my sister was in 2nd.
Coming from Minneapolis, what were some of the things that you liked about Milwaukee, and what were some of the things that you didn't like about Milwaukee?
Well, of course, I became a Braves fan, Milwaukee Braves, which was Major League Baseball. They won the World Series in 1957. They played at the old county stadium, and so to get from here to the stadium, there was a bus line and there was an old trolley line on Wells Street that went west. I don't remember the cost, but bus rides were a nickel or a dime. I don't remember the cost of the baseball games, or they certainly, for somebody who's 11 years old, wasn't very much. The Lake Michigan was a real nice plus for activities in the summer. Atwater Beach had a beach house with changing rooms, concession stand, bathrooms. So it seemed like the water was warm enough for us then. Now it wouldn't be warm enough for me. The neighborhood was very safe. There weren't any African Americans in the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, when I lived in Minneapolis, I don't remember seeing any black folks. We moved here, and we started to see more African Americans, but in my school, it was all white. But I got used to and acclimated to the neighborhood very quickly.
What did you do in your free time during summers or days after school as a child?
Well, we had Little League in Shorewood, so I played Little League. In the summers at the neighborhood, in the street, we played football and something called kick the can. And the police didn't like us playing on the street, so every once in a while they'd come and confiscate our football. And my dad or another parent would have to go to the police station and get the football back. Everybody had bikes, so we rode bikes all over the place. We played a game called, what's the name of that game? Strikeout. You needed two guys, a bat, and a tennis ball. And we'd go up to the playground and play that. We played pickup football, pickup basketball. That was mostly how we hung out. We didn't really spend much time with girls until high school, but we had girls in class, of course. St. Robert had a school of about 1,000. All the Catholic schools back then seemed to be very large. And in each grade, there were about 90 kids in each classroom, about 45. We sat in old wooden chairs that were screwed to the floor, and we always sat alphabetical. Each year we had a different nun. I was not used to having nuns in class. That's the same nun taught the whole year. And at St. Robert, there were very few lay people. And I think the music teacher was, and then maybe the librarian, the rest were all religious.
Are you still in contact with some of your friends from your childhood?
A few, absolutely. About 20 or more of my classmates went on to Marquette High School. So from my grade school, I still see probably 4 or 5 guys pretty regularly.
So you attended St. Robert's.
Yes.
How did you like it there?
It seemed to be I always liked learning and I always liked studying, so school was fun for me. I got accepted pretty quickly because I was the only guy with a leather football. And during playground, we either played football or a game called left-hand throw, which was played like baseball, only with a tennis ball. And the rules were you had to throw with your offhand for hits. And everybody wanted a kid named Pat Hahn on our team because he was big and he was ambidextrous. He could throw the tennis ball a mile with either hand. So whoever got him usually won.
Were there any sports your grade school offered?
We offered organized football in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and school basketball in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. We had an old gym until I started 8th grade. They had built an addition with new classrooms and a new gym. So my 8th grade was the first grade school to play our games in the new big gym. Other than that, I don't recall any girls' organized teams. Later on, I know they started girls' basketball and volleyball, but I don't recall them having those opportunities back when I was in grade school in the mid to late 50s.
What were your favorite subjects during school?
Well, I always liked mathematics, and in grade school, I don't recall if we had much science, but that comes probably my favorite classes and grades really became obvious when I went to high school.
What do you remember as a child about the tensions from the Cold War in Milwaukee?
Well, it's a very interesting question. We had Nike bases around the periphery of the city. Nike bases were guided missile bases. I think there were 8 of them. Actually, there was one down at the lakefront and then on the outskirts of the city. All families were encouraged to build bomb shelters in your basement. So we, under our basement stairs, I remember my parents stocked this little room with dry goods and blankets and batteries with flashlights. Probably, they didn't have bottled water then, so probably jugs of water. Luckily, we never had to use it. But there was definitely a Soviet scare when we lived in Minneapolis. My dad was a volunteer civil air patrol, and so what they would do is go to the top of the tallest building with binoculars and look at the sky to see if there were any invading Soviet airplanes, which seems kind of crazy now, but that was kind of the Soviet Red Scare back in the 50s, all the way to the end of the 80s. Then they had the nuclear arms buildup where the United States and Soviet Union built thousands and thousands of nuclear warheads and missiles.
In your school, did you guys practice any like drills in case of an attack?
As a matter of fact, I forgot about that. There were air raid drills. I don't remember tornado because tornadoes around here were extremely rare, if ever. But we did have air raid drills, probably like fire drills too. But so I forgot about the air raid drills. But I do remember a couple of idiosyncrasies. Anytime we heard an ambulance, we all made the sign of the cross. Walking past church, we were supposed to make the sign of the cross. All the masses were in Latin, and we had daily mass for the 3 years I was at St. Robert. I got into that, was an altar boy, choir member for a short time. And the altar boys, we like to do, especially weddings, because we got a little cash. Sometimes we made a little money doing funerals, but that seemed like a fun thing and a nice thing to do. We had 5 priests. I don't remember how many masses on Sunday, but the church was standing room only just for every mass. That's quite a bit changed from back in those days.
In grade school, do you remember any memorable moments, like any pranks, crushes, school dances, or field trips that you guys did?
I remember tearing my ligaments in my knee playing football 8th grade. I was on crutches for a while. That was the end of my football career. I don't think we had any organized dances. We didn't really have boyfriend-girlfriend much. I mean, they were friends, but there was no dating habits. We used to go to the village library, was right across the street from St. Robert. Now it's a restaurant. And sometimes we'd go to the library to study or to talk to girls, but that was about it as far as dating and dances. That came on much more in high school.
So, what made you decide to attend MUHS, and did you want to go there? Or
Yeah, I absolutely wanted to go to Marquette High. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Like I said, a lot of my friends were going. Out of my 45 males in my 8th grade class, I think over half went to Marquette High. Didn't know much about Marquette High. St. Robert's had free tuition. Marquette High's tuition was about $160 a year. I know what it is now. So very manageable tuition. Getting there, we often hitchhiked, any kind of weather, hitchhiked there, hitchhiked home until we started getting our licenses, and then we formed carpools. There also, the bus was an option. The bus stop was half a block from my house, and bus rides were, again, maybe a dime. But I knew it was all male, but I had no problem with that. I thought that was pretty cool.
Do you remember the first time you heard about Marquette, and what were your initial thoughts about it?
Marquette?
Yeah.
Well, it was pretty strict. Of course, grade school was strict, too, with the nuns, but Marquette High, we were given 3 demerit cards a year. Each card had 40 demerits. If you got 40 demerits, you got suspended. You had to memorize 3 pages of the Bible and get off suspension. You had to be able to recite the memory. And you also got 5 swats with a true temper golf shaft. I don't know if you guys heard of the old stories, but there was a disciplinarian, a big mean Jesuit, who carried around a true temper golf shaft all day. And if you were bad enough, you took a swat on the rear end. Or if you were an athlete and you wanted to get out a jug after school, you'd have to take a swat. And some guys tried to put magazines in the back, and the Jesuit was too smart for that. So that was but it was strict, but I had no problem with that. The great majority of the teachers were Jesuits, so there were 40-some. They all lived in a big dormitory that's behind school, which is long gone. There were a few male teachers. There was 1 female in the building, and that was the librarian. Other than that, there were no female on faculty, and maybe a couple of secretaries.
Did Did you ever get the bad end of the spanking?
I never got a SWAT, but there wasn't much spirit wear back then. If I don't remember any, but now there's all kinds of spirit wear. But almost everybody bought a Marquette High jacket, which had leather arms. And if you were an athlete and you got numerals or minor or a major, you'd wear it on your school jacket, or a lot of the major letter winners wore sweaters, leather sweaters. And they were allowed to wear them to school on certain days. There was a dress code. It wasn't real strict, other than you had to wear socks. I don't think blue jeans were allowed and T-shirts were allowed, but just about everything else was okay. We again, the classes were grouped according to ability. So the 1 class were the top 30 students, the 7 class were the bottom 30. I was in 2. All the classes were arranged alphabetically. There were very little, if any, electives. Now you guys got tons of electives. But we were pretty much told every year what we had to take. I had to take 4 years of Latin. I wish I would have taken something else. But your whole curriculum was pretty much laid out and designed for you.
What was different about the MUHS building when you took this?
Well, there was only one building. Now you'd call it the old building. The gym was on the 3rd floor. The present AP biology and physics labs and classrooms. There was a 500 capacity chapel on the 3rd and 4th floor, which are now 3rd floor classrooms and 4th floor classrooms. We had to have mandatory mass every day, again in Latin. They had hardwood kneelers, and if you got caught not kneeling by big upper class football players who were kind of the monitors, they'd make you squat in the aisles or kneel in the aisles. The cafeteria, well, in 1961, they had an addition to the building, which is now we call it the new gym in the cafeteria below. But right to the west was a car dealership, and right to the east was a practice field called the Rock Pile, which had a lot of rocks. But that's where the track and the football team practiced there. We had compared to today, we did not have all the interscholastic sports that you guys have. We had in the fall cross country, but it was not popular at all. And they had football, no soccer. That started in, I think, the late 60s. In the winter, swimming and wrestling and basketball. In the spring, tennis and baseball and track. But as far as lacrosse, rugby, soccer, volleyball, they didn't have that. Of course, the football team, when they practiced in the heat, there were only 2 coaches. And they were very tough, very strict, limited amounts of water, but they had salt tablets. So for some misguided reason, they thought if you took salt tablets, it would help. Well, that would almost kill you because it dehydrated you more. I'm surprised it didn't kill somebody. But that habit was soon became antiquated, luckily, obsolete. And they switched to a lot of water, no salt tablets.
Earlier you talked about hitchhiking to school. Did you ever have any problems getting a ride or have any interest?
Not really. I mean, not only did we hitchhike to school, we hitchhiked all over town and sometimes all over the state. Sundays where the football team played their games at the old Marquette U Stadium, which is now Quad Field. And it had a capacity of about 4,000. So it was very popular with the student body. The great majority of the kids went to the football games. They usually hitchhiked there when we were younger. And then we hitchhiked out to Gillis's for ice cream and to hang out and to meet girls, and then hitchhike home. And for me, the west side of Wauwatosa, 76th Street to here, I don't know, maybe 10 miles, and usually didn't have any trouble, even in all kinds of weather. Sometimes we get rides from the upperclassmen, and then I started driving when I was spring of my sophomore year, and luckily we had 2 cars, and so I was often able to drive a car.
Oh, so you said you got your car during sophomore year. Do you remember your first car?
It was a 1955 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 with a big V8 engine. So it's moved pretty well.
Do you remember any of the places that you and your buddies used to go to?
Well, we went to rock concerts at times, movies. When I was in grade school, they used to have these booklets, and I think for movies, and each ticket for a movie was like 10 cents or something. So we'd go to the Downer Theater in high school. We went to a lot of movies downtown. We had friends who had pool tables, so we'd go to a friend's house and play pool. Played little cards. But a lot of it was still local, going to the parks, playing pickup basketball, sometimes pickup football. But what I really liked about Marquette High, a lot of things, but meeting kids from all over the greater Milwaukee area. Now the area that you guys experience is even much wider. You get a lot of kids from West Bend, even some from Racine and way out west. So you really got to know the city very well, and you made a ton of friends from South. So we used to call them South Siders, West Siders, East Siders, and there was friendly rivalries. And then we got to know young women from all over the city.
Did you have any summer jobs in high school?
I did. First 2 summers after freshman and sophomore year, I caddied at Milwaukee Country Club. And there was a caddy bus that met kids from the east side on the corner of Green Bay and Capitol. So I would either hitchhike or get a ride out there, get on the caddy bus, take us to Milwaukee Country Club, and work all day, and then take the caddy bus back to that intersection. Summer of my junior year, I got a job in a gas station on Sherman and Capitol. It's called Wisco 99. Gas was about 20 cents a gallon. I think I got paid $1.15, and people would usually come in and they only spend a couple dollars. But you had to check their tires, you had to wash their windows, you had to empty their ashtrays, you had to check their oil, and I don't ever remember getting a tip. And it was not a big deal. I mean, it was decent money and could give me something to do. After senior year, for 3 summers, I worked at a can plant, Continental Can. That was a big company that eventually bought out my dad's company. And I made good money, but the work, you got so tired of it, by the end of the summer, you couldn't wait to get back to college. So that was two pluses, the money and the incentive to go back and study and work hard in college.
During high school, what did you mostly spend your money on?
Mostly?
Spend your money on?
Again, probably food. George Webb's, I think you get, 7 hamburgers for $1. So I usually stop that on my way home. Maybe partly tuition. Clothes here and there. Records here and there. Didn't spend much. I had collected pennies and stamps for a while. And I ended up selling those so I could go to Florida one summer or one Easter vacation. But that was about it. Things didn't cost much, and we just didn't spend much. Maybe, I think we used to have sock hops during the school year. And so that means you go to a gym, either Divine Savior or Marquette High, and take your shoes off. And maybe they charged you 50 cents or something, I don't remember.
You said you bought records and went to rock concerts. What type of rock concerts or what type of music did you
Well, I don't know if you'd ever recognize any of the names, but they were popular entertainers back in the late 50s, early 60s. And a lot of them were at the Riverside Theater, or now the Rave, which used to be, I can't remember what it was, the 24th in Wisconsin. They had guys like Fats Domino, James Brown, guys you probably never even heard of. And again, people from all over the city would come, and that didn't cost very much. And there was a place called the Southside Armory on South 6th Street. They just have a local rock band. So when we had cars, we'd drive down there and go to these rock band when they're playing. Again, it didn't cost much. I'd say that's pretty much what we spent our money on. Probably a lot of food, a lot of junk food. It's when I went to the dentist when I was a junior in high school, I had 17 fillings. So that's when I kind of gave up sweets.
Did you have a favorite date spot?
Well, again, probably movies. We started dating more sophomore when we had cars, sophomore, junior year. Probably go to people's houses, go to movies. In the summer, maybe a sporting event, the Brewers, and then now the Braves. The Braves left in 1966, so maybe even some baseball games here and there. The Braves left when I was in college, and then the Brewers came around 1970.
So why did you decide to go to Marquette University?
Well, I couldn't afford going anywhere else, basically. So I lived at home, and I didn't mind. I was called a townie, but I joined a fraternity, and I joined an organization called the Student Affiliates of the American Chemical Society. And living at home we could afford that. Had my own room and my own table and chair to study. I always liked studying and learning, so I had pretty good study habits from Marquette High. And I picked a major that was pretty challenging. I picked chemistry as a major, and at the time you had to minor in math, so I had 4 courses in calculus, which I totally forgot. And at Marquette you had to take 5 semesters of philosophy, 5 semesters of theology. You had to take 2 years of German, so I wish I would have had German in high school. So it was a really challenging subject and major. But like I said, I liked this. The reason I picked it, I liked it a lot, and I still do. So that's the main reason I went to Marquette was my family couldn't afford to send me out of town. But I enjoyed it very much. Campus back then compared to now has changed. I don't know if you guys have been on campus at all, but it's much, much nicer. Back then, some of the streets like 13th, 14th, and 15th Street were not closed off or built over. They went right through the campus. So to get from the Union to the library, you had to jaywalk or cross the street illegally. No big deal. And the police, there was a little conflict between the police and the students because we didn't think walking across the street on a street that wasn't very heavily traveled was a big deal. And so there was a little bit of a problem, a conflict with the law enforcement, but they finally learned that there was no reason to enforce the jaywalking laws.
What was the name of your fraternity, and what special things did you guys do?
It was AK Psi, Alpha Kappa Psi, and it was a business fraternity, but I wasn't into business, but Marquette kind of was limited to the fraternities. And it was a good way to, since I was a townie, it was a really good way to meet kids who lived on campus, and I made a lot of good friends. And I joined the Student Affiliates of the American Chemical Society because that was probably the profession I was going to go into, and so it was a good way to network, meet professors and speakers from out of town, and learn more about chemistry outside of the halls of the chemistry building in Marquette.
Do you remember the cost of tuition back then?
It was around $160. I guess it was a semester. It was, again, pretty cheap by standards now, but back then it was. I could probably earn that money in the summers. Books were much more reasonable. They were cheaper than high school books now. Nobody had backpacks. Hadn't been invented then. Of course, electronic devices we didn't have. Computers were just coming on the scene. I took a computer class where you had to type out cards. You probably don't even know what I'm talking about. Computer cards, and you had to write programs, and you had to take them to the center and submit your cards, and then they'd run them sometime. You had to come back hours later, and if it wasn't working right, it was very challenging, very difficult. Now it's tons easier than it was back then. What was unusual, a little bit, like I said, Marquette obviously is all boy. Being in class with young women was something to get used to at Marquette U, but quickly you got we got used to that pretty quickly.
Do you remember how much you made an hour during your summer jobs in college?
Which police?
During your summer jobs in college?
Well, yeah, I mean at Continental Can, I worked there for 3 summers. I earned, it was $2.50 an hour maybe. Back then, it was pretty good money. And if you worked third shift, which I did sometimes, you'd make more. You could get overtime. I did that for 3 summers. Then I worked at an industrial chemistry manufacturing company called Hydrite Chemical. I worked there 2 summers, and I liked that better because I was working with chemicals. It was a good way to kind of augment your professional career. And the family that owned the company I was friends with because I met them at Marquette High. So another kind of a nice byproduct of going to Marquette High, you met a number of kids and families who owned businesses, and so you could sort of sometimes get jobs with your friends or your friends' parents' companies. So that certainly was my case. When I got to graduate school, I worked as a brewing chemist one summer at Schlitz Brewery, and then I don't remember what I earned. When I got into my teaching career, which will probably be coming a little later, I still remember what it is, my starting salary.
So what made you fall in love with chemistry?
High school, I guess. They didn't have biology when I was a student there. They didn't. They had 2 classes, physics and chemistry. Now you've got a lot of electives and options. But for some reason, actually, this sounds a little geeky, but for some reason I had a chemistry set when I was a kid in Minneapolis. Why I wanted that, I have no idea. But I really enjoyed it when I took it as a junior at Marquette High. And I took physics. I liked physics a lot also. So when I started at Marquette U, I took physics and chemistry. And comparing the 2, I liked chemistry a lot more. So really, it grew, and my love for chemistry really blossomed in college. You had to take, I think, through my bachelor's and master's degree, I had something like 75 credits of chemistry. So that's a lot of chemistry.
What do you remember about the civil rights riots?
Well, this was kind of a national effort back in the 60s, and it kind of, in Milwaukee, grew to a head in the summer of 1968. It was a hot summer. They were rioting. I don't think there were any fatalities, but the National Guard was called. They had a curfew. Some streets were blocked. And I remember I had to go from my home in Shorewood down to the train station to pick up my grandmother who was coming in from Minneapolis. And I had a hard time getting there because of the roadblocks and the police. But I had to say, my grandmother who was 80-something is coming in a train. I've got to get her and pick her up. That lasted most of the summer. And most of the rioting occurred in the inner city.
What do you remember about the Vietnam War protests in Milwaukee?
Again, there were a lot of riots around the country. In Milwaukee, there was a group called the Milwaukee 14. 7 of them are priests who broke into the Selective Service Graph Board and stole the records of 4,000 young men, mine was included, and took them out to a park and tried to burn them all. And they got arrested, and one of the protesters was Irishman, and he got deported. My records got burned, but didn't really matter because I got into teaching and I was deferred from getting drafted. But there were riots. One of the worst was on Kent State University in Ohio, the summer of 1970. Some students were rioting and some National Guard shot and killed 4 college students. And they weren't shooting back. They didn't have guns. They were just protesting, and that was really a ugly problem.
Did you ever partake in any of these riots or demonstrations?
No, I was opposed to the war in Vietnam, but I did not participate in any protests. I didn't want to go in the Army, And luckily, the Army was giving deferments for teachers. And so I wanted to, I realized when I was in graduate school at Marquette, and I did some little bit of teaching in the department, that I really enjoyed teaching. So my first teaching job was in Burlington, Wisconsin. I was there for a year, and then I ended up at Marquette.
Did you know anyone that entered the war? Or
some friends of mine. Fortunately, some of my closest friends. Fortunately, nobody got shot and killed. And it's typical with most veterans, in my experience, don't want to talk about any war they've been in, whether it's World War II. My dad was in World War II, or the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or Afghan, or Iraq. Most veterans come back and they don't want to talk about it at all. They just want to go on with their lives. Some have post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is they struggle with, but luckily my friends that went there came back alive.
When the interstate was put in, did that change life for you at all?
I think they started building the expressway system around Milwaukee in maybe the late 50s. So I think the first parts of it, the downtown, and 43 did not go all the way up to Green Bay then. In 94, I think, went to Madison. But it's opened up in the summer of 1964. So that was a brand new driving experience. My first experience with heavy driving and expressways was in Chicago, my summer of 63. I'd never seen anything like it. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Chicago. Driving there is a big challenge. It was back then also. So that took a lot of getting used to, but now, it's second nature for just about everybody that's driving. And it's President Eisenhower, back in the 50s, it was his concept to build an interstate system all around the country. And now if you look at a map of the interstate system, it goes to every state, and some states have 2 or 3 parts of it. So it's been a great way to travel by car.
Do you remember the Packers playing for a brief time in Milwaukee?
The Packers used to play at the Old County Stadium. And depending on the year, sometimes they'd play 2 all the way to 4 games. I was fortunate enough to go to some of them. And my closest friend was an orthopedic surgeon, and so he was on the sideline for a couple games. And I had the opportunity to be on the sideline for 1 game. And then I realized how violent the sport was, because I was probably up close to where you guys are right now at some of the plays. They left Milwaukee in 1994 and played all their games in Green Bay, but season ticket holders in Milwaukee still had an opportunity to keep their season tickets, and those are called the Gold Package. So I think that people with the Gold Package now go to 1 exhibition and 2 league games. So when those games occur, the traffic from Milwaukee to Green Bay and back is very heavy with those ticket holders. I became a big Packer fan back in the early 60s, and maybe you've heard stories about they won the first championships. They didn't call it the Super Bowl back then. A lot of those players are in the Hall of Fame now. Bart Starr was the quarterback, and so some of the folks are still alive, and they're all legendary players.
Did you ever take the trip from Milwaukee to Green Bay?
A couple times. My first plane ride was when I was 21 years old, and I was a junior at Marquette, and Marquette was playing in the NIT championship. Back then, NIT was a much bigger deal than it is now. And they were playing Southern Illinois that had a star called Walt Frazier. And so Marquette was leading pretty nicely at half, but then Walt Frazier put on a one-man show in the second half, and Marquette ended up losing to Southern Illinois. Walt Frazier went on. He was drafted 5th that year, his draft class, and he was a star in the NBA and an NBA Hall of Famer. Marquette had their share, but not in 1967. Their great players came along in the 70s when Al McGuire was coaching.
So where did you work after graduating from college?
Well, I kind of look at my biography in phases or segments. The first was like grade school adolescence. The The second was high school, teenage. Third was college, like young adult. Fourth was adulthood, career, marriage, family. So after graduate school, I got a job teaching at St. Mary's in Burlington for a year. And our first child was born in Burlington, my daughter. I knew that I was going to stay in teaching, and the only place I really wanted to teach was at Marquette High because of my experience there. Luckily, I got a job the fall of 1970. I started as a chemistry teacher, and a couple years later, I was promoted to Dean of Students and eventually became assistant principal for attendance and discipline. And that lasted until 92. Then I went back in the classroom full-time until 2006 when I retired.
What about teaching that you like the most?
Say that again.
What about teaching that you like the most?
Well, of course, I was teaching a subject I really liked. And in Marquette, I obviously was all male. I had taught females at MATC night school for 35 years. But I just like the all-male environment. I guess I like the labs quite a bit. And as far as student enjoyment, usually most students enjoyed the labs more than the classroom part of it. And so setting up the labs and watching the labs, cleaning up the labs, I think was my favorite part of the course. Although when I taught AP Chem, the college level, those were basically some of the brightest kids in class. And so you could see their thirst for knowledge, or a lot of them ended up becoming chemical engineers or in another science field. So I guess one of my favorite things was seeing some of my students come back and tell me what they were doing as far as majors or careers. And again, a lot of them went into chemistry-related fields or medicine.
Did you grow any close relationships with any of your students?
Yes, I'd say 4 or 5. Probably my close relationship was a student named John Capriva. You might know his brother. He was a star basketball player at Marquette, but also quarterback on the football team. He went to George Washington University on a basketball scholarship, majored in chemistry, became a academic All-American, which is a pretty big deal, and is in medical school now, his third-year med student, and he's talking about sports medicine or orthopedic surgery. So we still get together. He's at Madison, so we still talk and get together when he's in town, but rarely is he in town anymore because he's so busy in medical school. I got a call from a former student who played scholarship volleyball at Stanford, got an engineering degree, just got a call from him a couple weeks ago, and he's going to be in town. He lives and works in California, but he wants to get together when he gets in town. So opportunities like that are really are the icing on the cake, as far as I'm concerned, of a career in education.
I have a funny story. My brother once had you in his applied chemistry class, and he remembers that one of the nicknames they had for you was Chainsaw.
I prefer Chain Gang, but Chainsaw is okay. Yeah, I don't know who came up with that, but it's kind of a name of honor, like a badge of honor. And, I wasn't insulted when they called me that behind my back. But, yeah, where that started, I don't know, but that's true.
So where did you get married, and what do you remember about that?
Well, I met my wife in 1966, I think. I was a junior, and she was a sophomore at Edgewood College in Madison. It was an all-girl college. I met her through a friend of mine whose father was head of the mafia in Milwaukee, Frank Balistreri. Her name was Benedetta Balistreri, and we were friends, and so Benedetta introduced me to my wife, Kathleen. We got married in the summer of '68 at St. Robert, and she was in education. She got a teaching job in Cudahy, teaching kindergarten. So I was still in graduate school. So we moved to an apartment in St. Francis, right near the airport, and lived there for a year. And then I got the job in Burlington. So she got the job at a job at the same school. And like I said, our first child was born there. We lasted there for a year and then ended up at Marquette for 46 years. And I also taught night classes at MATC for 35 years. Also college chemistry in the downtown campus of MATC.
You just mentioned the Milwaukee Mafia. Do you remember anything specific about that?
I do. Frank Balistrieri, my friend's father, eventually went to prison, but they lived in the east side of Milwaukee, and his daughter and I became friends in high school, and I'd be over at their house once in a while. And the father's lifestyle was a little different, obviously, than anybody else's, but he would sleep all day, get up sometime at night, put on a suit, and go to work. He owned some nightclubs and bars in town. And so what we could make of it was he would get together with his people and count the money sometime in the middle of the night and probably launder a lot of it. And then he'd come home with big suitcases filled with cash, which I only heard about, I never saw. And then he'd sleep all day. One of his favorite pastimes was car bombing. He allegedly car bombed, it was never proved, I don't believe, but car bombed and got rid of a couple people he wanted to get rid of. His operation was connected with the Kansas City Mafia, and as I said, he eventually ended up in prison. His two sons were Marquette High grads. One was older than I, and one was younger, and they both ended up in prison for a while. When they got out, they lost their law licenses, and the oldest one is deceased, and the younger one is in town. I'm not sure what he's doing. But when I used to talk to her on the phone, oftentimes you'd hear a clicking, and I said, Benedetta, what's that clicking? And she said, oh, the FBI is changing tapes for recordings. I found out later I met an FBI agent who worked on the case, and some of them moved into the house across the street from the Balistrieri house, unbeknownst obviously to the Balistrieris, and they used to spy on the house, probably take license plate. My license plate was probably taken down and investigated, but those are, and I remember going to some of his nightclubs. I went to Benedetta's wedding, and it was right out of The Godfather. All the men sat at a table with young secretaries, and all their wives sat at a table at the entrance collecting cash from everybody. And the custom was to give the bride and groom a lot of cash. Couldn't be traced.
Were you ever scared of being that close?
No. I did not get along with her older brother. So eventually, because of our relationship, I stopped going to their house, but I was never afraid of anything. Probably didn't even realize that I should be. I mean, I was just a friend of his daughter. I wasn't involved in the mafioso.
So you lived in St. Francis briefly. Do you remember anything about that?
I remember it's close to the airport, and we got used to the planes landing, but when the windows were open, a lot of soot would gather on the windowsills from the plane's exhaust. I think they probably improved the engines by now. But the manager of the apartment was breaking into our apartment, stealing blank checks from my checkbook, and then forging them. And I finally realized that. Police came and showed me one of these canceled checks. He was also stealing, back then, if you had a bank account, you'd get your canceled checks back in the mail eventually. And I was missing a couple of months, and I didn't think much of it. Well, he was also breaking in, stealing my mail, which is a federal offense. And so the police grew on to him. They went, raided his apartment, found all this stuff, found my canceled checks, and then came and talked to me in our apartment. And I went to testify against him, and his lawyer kept getting stays. I think I went 3 times. I was never able to I really wanted to testify, but I was never able to testify against him. And the reason we got the place, it had a swimming pool, which we thought was pretty cool. But I was working every day in the summer, and my wife was home, and a lot of the men in the apartment worked second shift. So they'd go around the pool and they'd party, and mostly guys, and my wife wasn't comfortable going down there by herself, so she just kind of stayed locked up in our apartment. But that was my first experience with ever living away from home. But it was fine. It was okay. It was safe, but except for the manager. So when he got arrested and jailed, then they brought in somebody new, and we were leaving a couple months later anyway. So when we moved to Burlington, we found a nice little flat, just a couple blocks from school. And Burlington's a very nice city, but it turned out to be a little too small for us. We wanted to come back to a little larger city, which we were used to.
When forming a family, did you ever think about heading back home to Minneapolis, or?
I love the area. I still do. Actually, I have thought about that. There's no Jesuit schools in Minneapolis. Way back many, many years ago, the bishop at the time, for some reason, didn't like Jesuits, so he wouldn't allow them to start a school there. This goes way back to maybe the turn of the century or something. They have Catholic schools, but not Jesuit schools. They have St. Thomas University, University of Minnesota, where my daughter went for a while. Actually, my number one son went to the University of Minnesota for a while. And I still like the area a lot. I have my youngest son lives up there, and so most of my relatives live up there. I'm always drawn back to Minneapolis, St. Paul. I always like to go to the old neighborhood, look at my old house, which I think we paid $15,000 for, and it's going for over $1 million a couple of years ago because of tremendous appreciation. It was a great location.
So what was it like starting teaching at Marquette, like at the school you once attended?
Well, remember the habit was for males to wear. I used to wear a suit every day when I started. I mean, there was no strict dress code for faculty, but that's just what we did. I don't know. It was since I went there, I kind of got the operation and how everything worked. I usually didn't give out too many demerits. I didn't have very many disciplinary problems. But one of the really nice things was how the building, the physical plant, kept growing from one building to now the building you guys experience is really classy. I mean, it's very, very nice. And so watching that and being involved in that was fun. Other than being assistant principal, at one time I was coordinator of the work grant program, coordinator of graduation. I was co-founder of the pay program. I staffed retreats, started a scuba diving club, coached cross country for 14 years. Mr. Carney and I started coaching in 1982. I stayed for 14 years, and he stayed up until just a couple of years ago. And now he's still a volunteer cross country coach. And it was a good way for the assistant, the designated bad guy, assistant principal, to get to know young men on a different level than only dealing with disciplinary problems. So that was very refreshing and very rewarding. The people I worked with, I thought were very impressive, very first-class educators. Most of them had master's degrees or even doctorates. So just the relationships you formed with your cohorts, I still see old friends frequently that I taught with. We get together and have lunch, breakfast, just get together and talk about old times. So most of my contemporaries are retired. There's still a few on the faculty, Mr. Prosser, Mr. Smith, but most of my contemporaries have retired recently.
You said you were assistant.
Well, I like the sports program. I still go to I went to 3 football games this year, went to a volleyball game. In the volleyball game, we were playing Dominican, and And I looked at the program, and our team was mostly sophomores and juniors. I thought, well, this must be a building year. They didn't look very good. What I found out after the game was they played all their second and third stringers because Dominican was so weak. The best team didn't even play, which I wanted to see them. I still go to tennis matches once in a while, track once in a while, cross country, basketball. So I really like to support the athletic program. And I really enjoy, this year I really enjoyed the football program because it was so successful. And I'm friends with some of the coaches on the football team.
You said you were assistant principal. Were there any students that always caused you trouble?
Many students.
That caused you trouble?
Many. I think more than there are now, for some reason. I think your contemporaries are more compliant with the rules. I think it's just the habits. Back in the 70s, it was pretty rough during the Vietnam era. The drinking age in the Milwaukee County for beer was 18. We had an open campus, so things were almost welcoming. You're almost asking for problems. So as far as expelling people, probably more back then than I think expulsion now is pretty rare. Of course, you guys probably know more than the faculty because administration really doesn't share much as far as disciplinary problems. So I find out problems from students more than I do from faculty. But I think the whole atmosphere is, as far as behavior, is better than it used to be. And I think that's just a sign of the times. I know the student population has dipped about 100 from where it was a couple of years ago. Last year was the biggest graduating class ever, about 275. I think this year's freshman class is around 250. And that's because of the demographics. There's a smaller pool of 8th grade men than there were in the past. You know, when I went there, I think 500 or 600 took the entrance exam. Now, I think maybe barely 300, maybe a little more than 300 take the entrance exam. Part of it's, it's pretty expensive, the tuition. The tuition now is, I think, more than going to UW-Madison. But all the Catholic schools have a lot of tuition. I mean, high tuition.
Do you remember when kids started to get drafted into the Vietnam War and how that impacted the school?
Say that again, please.
Do you remember when kids started to get drafted into the Vietnam War?
Started getting drafted?
Yeah.
Well, back in the 60s, they didn't draft high school students. When they used to they used to give deferments for if you were married. And as they needed a larger pool of draftees, they kept changing the draft laws. And then they gave up the marriage deferment. First of all, they had married with children, and then just married, and then college. You had to be in college full time, and then they went to a lottery system. And so every male 18 and above was given a random lottery number. And if you had lottery number 1, you're going to get drafted. Lottery number 365, couldn't get better than that. I don't remember mine, but it didn't mean anything because I was teaching and I had a deferment every year anyway from being drafted. But back it started it was pretty common in 65, 66, 67. They started drafting more because they started building up, escalating the war effort.
When did you start running marathons?
I got into serious distance running back in the late 70s. And I ran a lot of local races and finished my first marathon in 1979. I completed 7 marathons over probably the course of 10 years. The older I got, the harder it became. And Actually, I did a lot of running with Mr. Carney. And then as I got older, the distances got shorter and the speeds got slower. And eventually I had some physical problems, so I gave up distance running. I studied Shorin-ryu karate for 3 years. I really liked that, but I found that karate and distance running were not compatible. You're using different muscle groups. And so I decided to give up karate. I got into scuba diving about 16, 17 years ago because I was always interested. So I have about 260 logged dives. As I mentioned earlier, I formed a diving club and a scuba homeroom at Marquette High, and that existed for a little over 10 years. And I took groups of students on dive trips to Mexico in the summer. I think maybe six or seven times. Even some of the dads, divers, and even a mom diver joined us at times. But I haven't been able to do that for the last couple of years. So those are kind of my avocations. Now I go to a fitness center pretty much daily and do what I can as far as working out.
Where did your love for running begin?
It began when I was back in the mid-'70s, and I don't know why. A friend of mine was into it, and I started it, and it just seemed so natural. And it was pretty easy at the time. Some of the benefits of distance running, I could sleep better, and think my thinking, my brain function was stronger, and I liked being a dean of students. You need to be physically fit back then. You had to get around the building all the time. We didn't have an elevator, so I'd walk up and down the stairs and patrol the building and outside, and so the more fit you were, the easier it was. Then I met some really good friends who were into running, and I had a whole different group. We'd run on weekends and we'd go to races, and some of them were national class runners that I wasn't, but I got involved with them, and it's just a whole new group of friends that at the time running marathons made a lot of sense. Now I have no idea how I could do it. I can hardly walk now. So, but it was really a part of my life that was very fulfilling.
You said you were part of you did scuba.
Scuba?
Scuba. Did you ever scuba off Lake Michigan?
I did. I gave up cold water diving. By the way, that's inland lakes in Lake Michigan. But my first dives since I got certified in Milwaukee, my first real dives were in Lake Michigan. And the surface right now the surface temperature of Lake Michigan is about 42. Back when I started, let's say it would be in the 50s, but there's a thermocline, and below a certain level the temperature doesn't change, and that's in the low 40s. So it's hard to tolerate that temperature. And finally, it wasn't fun anymore. In Lake Michigan, unless you're a technical wreck diver, which is dangerous, and I don't do that, there's nothing much to see. But in the Caribbean and in like the Florida Keys and other areas of the world with the coral reef system, and there's so much marine life, anywhere from pelagic like sharks, octopi, all the way down to macro fish, which are you can hardly even see with your eyes, and everything in between. And so it's a whole different world. So that's why I enjoy it. And plus the warm water is very comfortable. Visibility is really good, 80 to 100 feet. Whereas inland lakes, the visibility, even the cleanest lakes, is not very good. And there's not much to see. Technical diving, which are the wrecks, that's a whole different, and cave diving, that's a whole different skill set, a whole different training, and it's pretty dangerous. So I was never attracted to doing either type. But the equipment is much more specialized, very expensive, and I've known some wreck divers, but it wasn't for me. So freshwater diving was and warm water diving was I really liked. I'm trying to do one more dive in the Caribbean this summer. I'm still trying to, or next summer. So I'm still trying to figure that out.
Did you have any other jobs we didn't talk about or volunteering?
Well, I had some professional opportunities through the years. The summer of 1994, I was awarded a internship by the Department of Energy to study at UCal Berkeley. And so I studied electron microscopy for 8 weeks. And UCal Berkeley is one of the strongest chemistry programs in the country. So I was pretty lucky, and I got paid to do that. I worked as a lab consultant at Hydrate in the summers for a number of years. I worked at S.C. Johnson Wax and their research labs in Racine one summer. Again, studying gas chromatography, and they have all kinds of fancy instruments and equipment. I worked at a pharmaceutical lab one summer in 2007. Again, that chemistry is very complex, and I learned a lot. So those are some of the opportunities I had to advance my career, my professionalism. I was an advanced placement chemistry reader and College Board consultant for 7 years. AP readers have to read all the exams, which is not a lot of fun, but they did it at Clemson University. And it was another good way to, I think, become a better AP teacher. You got paid well, but the work was very boring and challenging. I met some nice people, but after 7 years, I had to quit that. I couldn't do it anymore. But those are some of the things that I was lucky enough to do during my summers over the last, 40 years or whatever. So that was, I was lucky to be able to do that.
What do you remember from working at the S.C. Johnson?
I remember a lot of fancy equipment that, of course, high schools don't have. A lot of PhDs. S.C. Johnson is a very big company. I don't know where it is in the Forbes 500, but they make things from like Windex. They have many products, big, well-known products. And I just remember working with some very highly educated and trained scientists, and the opportunity to use a lot of equipment that not too many people have been able to use. Again, even some of the best colleges didn't have some of this equipment. So I was, and I got paid to do that. So I was pretty lucky. Most high school chemistry teachers have not had the opportunities I've had. So I've been kind of lucky. Met a lot of nice people.
I remember going to Discovery World once to see you.
Oh, Discovery World. I forgot about Discovery World. Yeah, Discovery World started here 1986 at the library. So over the years, some of the big events that have started in Milwaukee was Summerfest, started in '68, very small scale. Discovery World in '86. But when they built a new building, they had maybe you've seen it, a Caribbean fish tank with a glass tunnel. And I was a volunteer diver in this Caribbean tank for 12 months. I worked about every other weekend, feeding the fish and the marine life, and then cleaning that glass tunnel that people walk under. But after a year, I was going to give up 12 months, and then I just quit going there. But I used to take my scuba club on tours of Discovery World, inside tours. Bradley Center was built in, was that 88? Of course, Miller Park in 2001. If you guys don't know how Bradley Center got its name, Jane Bradley Pettit was one of the richest women in the area. She was an Eland heiress, and she married a guy named Pettit, who was a hockey announcer for the Blackhawks. So she contributed, I think, $80 million to the Bradley Center, and Pettit always wanted to use it to bring an NHL team here, but that never happened. So the infrastructure was designed for a hockey team. So if you ever sat up in the upper chairs and you're hitting your knees, that they've got I heard that they got a zoning variance to build stuff like that. They got an exception. Whereas now, if you've been to the Fiserv Forum, it's pretty impressive.
So, we just talked about the Bradley Center, and the Milwaukee Bucks played there for a long time. Do you remember the first years, the couple of years that they were here?
This must have been the late 60s, early 70s. I remember him Lou Alcindor, which was his first name. Abdul Karim Jabbar was on the team. I think they won the World Championship. To be honest with you, never a huge Buck fan. I'm a Marquette, we call them the Warriors, but now the Golden Eagles basketball fan since I went there. The sports I like are spectator sports are mostly college and pro football. I used to watch pro hockey a lot, but I just I got out of the habit and the interest. So I'm starting to follow the Bucks more now because they're playing. They've got some really good players and they're doing pretty well. So I watch them on TV every once in a while, or at least I follow them, the statistics to see how they're doing. But as far as professional sports, I like pro football, and college sports I like football also.
All right. I think that's all we have today.
Okay. As they say in German, das ist alles. Meaning, that's all. Thanks, fellas.